bi-monthly show with Jane Curtis, and she is going to reveal mysteries of Easter Island. Let's hope she has some answers to those mysteries, because there certainly are a lot of mysteries around them. Jane?
Good morning.
Reveal them.
Well, I'm not going to start out having a call-in contest. Who knows where it is?
Right.
Say exactly where it is. No, instead of that, we're going to look at the first picture, which is a nice map.
Okay. Let's
And
see
that will show
map.
us where Easter Island is located.
Where Easter Island
It's
is.
a South Pacific island, and Samoa happens to be in the middle there. If you look at this map, you'll see up there where San Francisco is, and it's about 2,000 miles, a little over 2,000 from there to Honolulu.
Right.
Well, if our map went down the coast here, we would go down into South America. See, there's Southern California coming off there, and about 2,000 miles across it in the South Pacific on the way to Samoa is Easter Island.
Okay, kind of out in the middle of nowhere.
And in the middle of nowhere, practically. It happens to be an important ocean current, the Humboldt Current, which comes up from South America and then cuts across.
Okay.
It's more or less right on that. So it really isn't exactly in the way to anywhere. And it was discovered by the European side of civilization in not really until the 1700s. But before that, it is believed that the people are Polynesian. They have a language whose roots are also Southeast Asia and similar somewhat to the Hawaiian and Tahiti and those places. So it in language, it's really kind of the far eastern outpost of Polynesia, the group that are called Polynesia.
Okay.
Now, the island itself is only 63 square miles. And you compare that, Manhattan is 23, and builds up to Staten Island is 50 some, and on up. So there are a lot of small islands. But that one, if we look at the next picture there, will show us that the island's a little sort of roughly triangular shaped thing here.
Right.
It was never attached to any land mass. It's one of those ocean floor volcanoes. So it has porous rock, soil, and so on. You can see it has volcanoes, different places inside there, which have built up such of the land that is there. It has a subtropical climate. It's a friendly climate. And it is believed that people came by boat, either just a few or maybe several boatloads. Maybe they were outriggers, which are popular boat, canoe type boat in that area. But they found it, some sources think, well, early 300s, 400s AD, this is when Hawaii was first known to be settled. Some say a little later. The bottom line really is that by 1200 AD, there was known to be civilization there. And how do we know? We know because of some carbon dating, radiocarbon dating of things on the island. And interestingly enough, there's fossil pollen, this nasty pollen that makes us sniff and cough and so on. It's a very potent and powerful thing, and fossil, it can last a long, long time. Fossil pollen also indicates that by that time, by 1200 AD, there were people living there. Yeah, but it was not, as I say, until a little later. Now, in between, I found a reference. The year 1650 was indicated by some of this fossil pollen that the trees were all gone. There had been trees on the island, a lot of trees, palm trees, and it was a fertile little scrap. Volcanic soil is often very fertile. So by 1650, unfortunately, the real trees are gone. There may have been some small things around, but that was it.
Did they have any reason as to why? Is it volcanic activity or man activity or?
Well, they have theories as to why, and we will start peeking into them right now. When we were in our young days, the first theories I ever heard about that were that they were warlike and they forever getting into their canoes and going fighting their neighbors. And the last tree went when they saw some kind of danger or a chance to bash their neighbors. So they cut it down and made a canoe, went off, and of course it went on where they never won and just kept on. But that theory was tossed into a cocked hat because there weren't any neighbors.
Oh, there weren't any neighbors.
Thousands of miles, at least hundreds of miles. There weren't any. There were the tiny little things that popped up in the ocean, but nothing that had any people or possibly of doing that. So the next theory, which is probably the reasonable one, is that this group that came over from Western Polynesia settled there, and it was a thriving deal. And so their population increased. So what did they? Well, they needed a little more arable land. They could grow, basic crops there. So what did they do? They chopped down a few trees. And you just suddenly think of Brazil a couple of months back, what was happening there. They chopped down a few trees, planted it, and went on. And as time wore on, these hundreds of years, of course, the population increased and slowly, but the population increased and the tree population decreased. The deforestation increased too. So it is believed now that that's pretty much what happened to get rid of the trees. In the 1700s, the Europeans discovered it by accident and then later went back now and again. It seems remarkable to me. They really couldn't do longitude too well, but to find that little dot out there in the ocean was remarkable. But they did anyway, and of course if they came up the Humboldt Current, get near it, and they don't near it. But they did. At any rate, it was a Dutch explorer who stumbled onto it, and it happened to be Sunday, April the 5th, Easter.
Easter Sunday.
1722.
Okay.
And his name was Roggeveen. And Roggeveen and his merry band found it, and they are reported to have killed 5 local people on the island. I don't know if that's true or false, but the number 5 appears in these reports of it, and maybe wounded a couple of others, and stayed a few days, and I probably loaded up their water casks and went off. And nothing happened for, some years, because the next one to come across the place was a Spaniard coming out from Peru, from the Spanish colonies in Peru. They found it. Well, they sailed around the island and they surveyed it and mapped it a little bit and didn't do an awful lot. But they mentioned that there were trees on the island, small trees, and they mentioned the people. They said this early description of a Polynesian group. There were no black, there were no white, they were all different shades of brown. So that's interesting there, whether it was all exactly the same DNA group or some mixtures along the way or whatever, nobody knows, but they were, and generally they were nice looking people, the Hawaiians, for instance, that type of looks. So, and a small population, they didn't go into numbers there, but at any rate, they stayed there a little bit. And a few years later, the English came along. Captain Cook was there in 1774. And interestingly enough, Captain Cook said, there are all these statues, but they're knocked down, they're toppled down.
So he's the one who found those figures that we keep seeing.
Oh no, the figures were there.
Yeah,
the figures were standing up, and the earlier Europeans that had seen it, the figures were there and they were standing. And Captain Cook found that they were knocked down. They were weathered, quite weathered. But the trees were not much. There were hardly anything, maybe kind of bushes. But you will see later, we'll look at a couple of pictures. So nobody laid a claim to it until 1888, Chile formally annexed it.
Okay.
And it wasn't until some later year, 1900 something, that they made these people citizens, but the population went up and down and up and down. The worst period really was in the middle of the 1800s, because by 1860 the Spanish from Peru had discovered that there were these people, these natives over there that they could turn into workers.
Slaves, basically, yeah.
Slaves, basically. But it was interesting, when I read it, I said that they were indentured servants sent over to the mainland to work. And you think, sure, they were let go later. But apparently they were, some of them were, there weren't that many of them. But a few years later, in 1862 or 3, they were released. And they had included the king. They didn't have a king in our sense of the term, but just sort of a leader, primary person. And his grandson had been over there, and they had died in captivity. But coming back, all was not peaceful again, because, and of course the population, they had taken, the slave traders had taken away 1,500 people.
Oh, wow.
And the total population is estimated around 3,000 then. And when you think of Manhattan or Staten Island, all those people on it doing living a full, civilized life, so to speak. But they, at any rate, they brought back with them from the mainland those 3 awful plagues that the missionaries and the explorers brought with them all over the world. And that was TB and smallpox and venereal disease. And on a population that small,
oh yeah,
and with no frills to their civilization, it just ravaged them again. As I say, a few were returned, but I kept a tally here. It was estimated 3,000 originally, and when the slave traders took 1,500 of both genders, it would have gone down to that. A few years later, it was down to 930. Somebody did a count. And it descended then, let me see, in 1877, there were estimated to be only 111
oh, my goodness.
Of the original ones left. And of those, only a few had offspring. So way down, you think, well, they're gone. But they weren't gone. And it's curious, I didn't find any figures today for how many. They're called, the native name for it is Rapa Nui. And Nui means great or big. And Iki means small, I found this out. So E.T., not E.T. So Tahiti is small something. And other ones that have that E.T. on the end, it's, the British say, so Great Barham and Lesser Baron or Parva, and we say, well, what do we say? In fact, think of a good example. We don't, well, little.
Kitchen or kitchenette.
Well, no, I'm in a place. We say Little Falls, Great Falls and Little Falls. We have right
Great
here.
Falls, right.
So there was the Rapa Nui were the ones who had settled in there, but it went up and down and up and down. What happened also before the end of the 1860s, a Frenchman, Duclos, had sailed over there, and he had enterprises going in all the islands around there. Apparently he had some coconut plantations here and there. But he was hired on to deliver some missionaries, more missionaries to Rapa Nui, to Easter Island. And he kind of sized the place up. And next year he came back, sized it up again, and in 1868 he moved there, and guess what he established? A sheep ranch.
Sheep ranch.
And this went on for many years. At one time, it was estimated 70,000 sheep were being raised. Now it's hard to figure how they could profit by ship, of course, taking all these sheep. I don't know how many you put on one ship in those days, but getting the sheep out there, and you'd have to take fodder for the sheep because you couldn't grow it there.
Wouldn't be any feed.
But apparently it was very, very sad. It lasted until 1953. There was still sheep ranching, and it was a British, Peruvian, some sort of a joint venture there. And what did them in was artificial wool. you don't say artificial, what do you say? Synthetic wool. It did them in finely. So their main industry today is tourism.
I expected you to say he established a pineapple plantation if he was into pineapple before.
No, I think pineapple need better soil than they had out there. But I want to look at some pictures now, and so you can see what it would be like if you went out there on a tourist flight. They have a small airport, a tourist flight, and I think once in a while a cruise ship even goes by there. But let's, now here is a picture. This goes back, way back 200 or 300 years to the, that's a Hawaiian outrigger. And the best picture I could find that was an old picture was this one. You just see it has two hulls there and two fronts. You can tell it's an outrigger. But it would have looked something like that, and they would have had some sort of sail. These people were not stupid. They were wise in what they could do with their soil, and they knew how to make boats, and they knew how to sail a little bit. But they didn't dare, of course, go very far. So the next picture we see is, if we can zero in on that a little bit too, on any part of where the people are standing, you see they built platforms. And you see a platform there with stones in it and a little soil. And on it are lined up 15 of the statues. Now, obviously, this was not the way they were found.
Right.
And that's a mystery I haven't solved, exactly who and when was involved in moving all the statues. Because as we look now in this next succession of pictures, we can see. So let's just see the next one. And you can see how they were weathered. And here they are set in line in another location. This is not all, well, yes, it is all 15 this time, from the front. And then from the back, the next picture shows us the same row. We don't know if they, they obviously weren't meant to resemble their own people. And they apparently were not to resemble deities because they did not have a far-reaching early religion. They became Catholic after the missionaries were there, but not in any important sense of the term. But the next picture, these same things from the back, and now they look very much like Far Eastern things, like something in Siam, the figures. And it's not known whether these figures were originally totally freestanding or whether they were, and then partly buried, because there were not any real volcanic eruptions since then that could have buried them. But many of them have the body, the trunk, but nothing else. And then above it, these heads. And as we continue, and you see some of the platforms there, as we continue, we see here the same 15 lined up on the shore. And you can see a little bit of the topography of the island here, little things sticking up in the water. The next one is this same group again, and they're on a higher point of the island. Once again, nice weather most of the time there, apparently. I suppose subject to the storms, typhoons and things. Going on to a picture, we see the, let's have the next one, please. Yes, we see these curious things on the heads.
Now this is a totally different
that were not
group.
on the heads, on the other heads. Were they the same heads? But nobody really has or I haven't at least found any exact explanation of what that might be. It doesn't seem to resemble anything that anybody ever saw. The next one again is one of these heads. This is a bit to scale. Seeing it lying on the ground, the same area there, and you can see to the right there's slanting, there's the forehead, and then the nose zoops up there to the left. Enormous head. So these things were very large. And moving them around, now here are some more. And other times they've been found scattered at random. And you see slow growth on the ground. Oh, fine for sheep grazing, I guess, but not for their permanent raising. But again, the next shot will show us a close-up of some of those. How did they move around? That would be my big question.
So they're basically all over the island in different spots?
Well, they are now. They were only found, of course, in one place.
Oh, okay.
But, or well, no, they were found in different areas, but not over the whole island. But putting them in rows, again, seems to have been done later. Now, they had their own language, which again is an very interesting thing, and a sign that they were not just a bunch of silly people. This is beautifully etched onto a piece of stone, piece of rock. And you can see they have similarities to the old Minoan Cretan and to Egyptian hieroglyphics, and just carving them in there that neatly. And they're not scratched lines. They're rounded lines and figures. The next one is a picture of how somebody studied it and worked at it, and they drew and listed then some of these and what they think they might have meant. This is what they're a picture of. Also, this gives you a clue that they ate a lot of seafood too, that they were into doing that. And that there were palm trees, there were trees, and just looking at them, there's a chevron, a popular pattern in many different places. People, the person sitting, a bird. It shows that they definitely had. I mean, what was written on that piece of stone we just looked at was really something written.
Right.
Not just doodling. Going on.
But nobody's really figured out what it says.
No, it's not been deciphered. Whether they didn't have any syntax, whether the reader had to fill in the syntax, or if you just saw the picture. In that case, it could have been only a picture language, but would have had concepts, like using a picture of something large for the word large instead of the object. But going on to another shot here, this is a very interesting picture. They also had their own local customs. This is 4 young men reenacting something which was called a Birdman competition. Now, behind them and down the steep slope, or off to sea a little bit, there's this rocky isle. And this happens to be an isle where the sooty tern, the seabird, T-E-R-N, where the sooty tern returned every year to nest and lay its eggs.
Oh.
And where they hatched and flew off and came back every year. So every year, at the time when there were eggs in those nests, one young man from each of the little towns or regions on the island there would be selected and would have to go down there, swim out to the island, go to a nest, take an egg, come back, climb this practically vertical slope, and with the egg intact, and to be the winner of the competition. And I don't know what you got, but it was a very important thing and a fascinating, I think, folk custom, showing you their so many things about them. They weren't, they weren't dull, inert people.
Right,
they were lively and did things. Even looking at a better part of that picture, you can't see exactly how they were carrying the egg, but they must have had to come home with the full. Yeah, why the mama sooty tern didn't get in there and hack them to pieces?
Right.
Forgetting, who knows? But back now to this picture you just had up. This is the only one I found that has European type things. I think the man standing there is the Frenchman Duclos. And he married a local woman, presumably Chiazette, and declared that she was queen. And they had 2 little girls, and they became princesses. And one of them later figured in some ceremonies. But the rest are islanders. And they had, clearly the man standing there is a European, but the others are islanders. They had a very nice ceremony that they did when they were made formally. I guess they were given more status within Peru. They had become possession of Peru, and this was 2003 or whatever it was. And what they did, this king, quote unquote, would step up and take in one hand a handful of grass, in the other hand a handful of dirt. And this Peruvian naval officer, who was the official representing the government, would go through the mumbo jumbo and they would sign things. And then this man, this Rapa Nui, that was called the people Rapa Nui, would hand the grass to the Peruvian, to the official, and it would keep the dirt as a symbol that you could give away some dominion over your land or some
your growth,
aspects like that. But basically, it was yours.
Yeah.
It was yours. I think that's really one of the most charming ceremonies I've ever really noticed.
Very
there.
symbolic.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're nearing the end, so
Oh, well,
we can wrap it up.
I think we'll, perhaps if we went back to the very beginning and maybe look at that second picture again, I want to show a little bit. The first picture is a nice map, the blue and green map of the Pacific, and the one after it then is the triangular one, that fairy one. Down south there where you see the volcanic crater, that's the place where the young men go off down the cliff and swim out to that bit of rock there and have to steal an egg from an enormous seabird and bring it back. And you see then now where the tourist things are, up the west coast there is, there's a town, and there are a couple of other smaller towns, but I actually found, when I looked pictures up online, I found one that showed a fried chicken place, believe it or not. Yeah, a mag, and, with a couple people outside. And undoubtedly, and you see a few pictures of a kind of city street and the tourists.
They go everywhere, don't they?
And there are pictures of tourists, you know, look at these things.
Where the tourists go, the fast foods will follow.
But now they can say, but imagine that island, all that's been through, that's been, since it popped up out of the ocean, you know, who knows when.
Yeah.
Maybe a few thousand years ago. But it's been through all these ups and downs, and it's still hanging on. There are still native people out there. The population was 7,000 and some in, about 15 years ago. I didn't
But nobody
catch it
still
anymore.
knows anything about where those figures came from or what they represent.
But the older things, you can't tell. But there they are. And there they've hung on, and their DNA shows that they're absolutely real. But an interesting little spot on the globe.
Someday someone might find out.